we've seen a lot of large brands in recent history, like Johnson and Johnson, Uber, Taco Bell. They all recently decided to do away with this chief marketing officer position, right? And they replaced them with roles like chief growth officer or chief experience officer or chief commercial officer, chief brand officer, etc. It seems to be this kind of shift in the CMO role. Like, should we be saying goodbye to the CMO role in 2022 and beyond? Like, what's happening and what do you observe there?
Yeah, what's the famous Mark Twain thing about reports of my death are, overestimated or something like that, or at least premature.
Yeah,
Um,
greatly
yeah,
exaggerated.
so
Yeah, yeah,
great exaggerate. There we
yeah.
go. Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. A couple of things. One is that question actually is one of the central driving questions for this new executive master's degree that we're starting. It's actually that question in a way that started to animate us all to think about what is the role, what's the emerging role of the CMO and chief communications officer, perhaps even, revenue generation. How do all those things develop over time? So one of the things we know that's critical, and I think I'll answer your question, but sort of I'll get there in pieces. One of the things I think we know is critical is that there needs to be, or there's some perception that the marketing teams have not been as closely aligned to the growth objectives that the CEO and CFO, for example, might articulate, as the real drivers of the business. You could argue that that's not because that was never marketing's role. I would argue it's always been marketing's role, to build. I think Tonio Lucio talks about, sort of building sustainable brands that will last, that will last a lifetime and grow. His focus has always been, for example, on growth, but it's the focus is marketers building sustainable brands that will lead to that kind of business growth. But so you could argue that it's always been the focus, but there are some that have said that the two things I've heard are one, that there was a distraction with digital, which is fascinating in a sense because digital was perhaps the most measurable of all of the marketing efforts to date, but that they were very strong perhaps in terms of performance marketing, but didn't do very much broadly to grow the brand, or they took marketers themselves weren't necessarily focused on, how does this become transformative to the business and actually create new business models, new business opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one argument. And I'm not really putting my finger on either scale here. And the other, I think, is an argument which is perhaps a little easier to accept, is that marketing, whether it liked it or not, was always historically seen as sort of the creative people, the folks who, at the end of the day, tell wonderful stories, create wonderful advertising. Again, that's not what we teach at NYU. It's we indeed the degree is an integrated marketing degree. We all know that it's the four P's and more. But there was a sense, I think, in some companies that the marketers didn't quite have a seat at the table because what they did was sort of the nice stuff at the end or the pretty stuff at the end. And again, I go back to the sort of Keith Weed idea of, bringing the outside in and the future forward. There's always been a role for chief marketing. The third thing I think, which I think is a very legitimate argument, and I can understand why, C-suites or boards get to this place, is that in a similar way when we talked about, integration of marketing and PR, the touch points, to consumers that will then lead to positive engagement, positive, profitable revenue, long-term, relationship building, all of that are mediated through so many different things, through customer service, through sales, through marketing, through social media, etc., that you could understand the desire of a CEO to say, look, we've got to coordinate all of that. We've got to bring that together. Someone needs to orchestrate that. Someone needs to think that through more holistically. And that someone should have a sort of very clear eye at the end of the day on growth, And so I think that's what has started to happen, where you see collapsing. First you saw collapsing of CMO and CCOs. That was more around the communications function. Then you saw, collapsing of revenue and marketing, or sales and marketing. And then you sometimes see sort of strategy, revenue, marketing all kind of coming together. And so you've got this idea that, back to this notion of business transformation, if someone's really going to have these powerful levers at their disposal, like marketing and PR and Salesforce is that they need to be thinking about that in a more coordinated way. So that's my sense of where it's coming from. I don't think we'll see the death of CMOs. I think there's a resurgence in many sense of re-examining the important role of marketing in all of that equation, and ensuring, at least again back to the executive masters, our belief is any CMO or CCO or an emerging one of those should have those skill sets, whether they're called the chief growth officer or not. That should be in their minds, in their mindset, their faculties, their way of perceiving the world, the way of managing should include that orientation. It's not separate from marketing. So
something that you're speaking of that reminds me of a conversation I had with Jawad Bizbis, who's the global VP of marketing at the Ball Corporation, Ball.com. Really cool brand. Up to some interesting things, and he talked about a lot of his time is also just kind of petitioning to the board of directors, to other stakeholders of changing the narrative around seeing marketing as this cost center or as this pure creative play. It's like he's really kind of, in some ways, having to use a lot of time and energy, saying, no, the marketing brings much more than what it used to bring, right? And to change the narrative amongst the stakeholders and the boards. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of observations about that. One is there's some work which you may or may not be familiar with. There's a wonderful prof at Northwestern called Mohan Biasoni, and he wrote an article, and it's got to be 10, 15 years old, but or more so even, because I remember when I was at Time Warner using it as a very important sort of touchstone for me. And he described what he called, it's probably hard to describe verbally, but he described these, what he called 3 horizons of marketing. And basically it was this idea that, the impact of marketing marketing will have impact across these 3 horizons. So the first sort of tier was this idea of demand generation. Yes, the basic job of marketing, quote unquote, is to generate demand or generate qualified leads that convert into sales, etc. And it has revenue, as a measure. The second he talked about was this idea of building brands, so to the extent that you are working on building a brand and brand relationships, and you're building something that has more enduring value as an asset. But the third category, which if I remember the chart well, he called thought leadership, or the idea of building entirely new capabilities or building into new business arenas and new business models. That was also a part of the marketer's role. And I think perhaps what we're looking at here is some of those higher order sort of horizons got lost a little bit, and CMOs, while they've always been in a position and should have always been in a position where they can have that conversation, or not just conversation, but be having active impact, perhaps they lost that, and there are some thoughts about why that might have happened in some of the emerging technology companies, which are much more, about this product is insanely great, they're more product led than they are, say, marketing or brand led. But so some thoughts about why that might have happened. But there's no reason that marketing leaders, there's nothing definitional about what we do as marketing leaders that says we can't inhabit those, roles where we're actually providing, counsel and driving initiatives to explore whole new businesses. One related thought, because I think I don't want to go too far into the metaverse unless you do, but one of the interesting things Todd Kaplan said, so he's the CMO of Pepsi, and he we listened to what he had to say at one of the panels at Cannes, and he made a statement, which is interesting to pass out. He said, potentially Pepsi is more than a product, it's a brand. Well, clearly it's a brand already. I don't think he didn't mean that, but what he meant was maybe Pepsi in the future is a music business or an entertainment business, that the metaverse is allowing them, for example, to explore some of those things. And I think that's the sort of, if the CMO is at the C-suite board level, having those conversations, leading those conversations, I think that's what the aspiration is, in fact, one of the themes of Cannes was business transformation. I think that's the aspiration that marketers, have and want to recapture.
This podcast is brought to you by Salesforce and the CMO Club. The CMO Club is a global community for senior marketing executives to come together, share ideas, and solve their toughest challenges in a collaborative and trusted environment with other marketing leaders. Salesforce and the CMO Club provide best-in-class programs, events, and a digital platform for marketing leaders to come together and be inspired like never before. Join our global community at thecmoclub.com.